Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Parker. I'm Senior Fellow here at the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. And we're here tonight for a forum discussion on religion and politics, two topics which, if you were raised in a proper family as I was, were never to be brought up at the dinner table. And so hopefully you've all had dinner and are prepared for what I hope and I'm sure will be a lively and informative discussion. Our guests this evening are, to my immediate right, Professor Anna Greenberg, Assistant Professor of Public Policy here at the Kennedy School of Government, whose research focuses on the role of churches in civic engagement in the development of democratic values. To her immediate left is Rabbi Michael Lerner, the editor of Tikkun magazine and the author of The Politics of Meaning, Restoring Hope and Possibility in an Age of Cynicism, and a rabbi in San Francisco. To his immediate left, standing in for the Reverend Joan Brown Campbell, head of the National Council of Churches, who because of illness cannot be with us, is the Reverend Al Pennebaker, pastor in the Christian Church's Disciples and Associate General Secretary of the National Council of Churches for Public Policy and also Director of the NCC's Washington office. Next to him, I'm pleased to have with us Jeff Taylor, Director of Government Affairs for the Christian Coalition, and to his immediate left, Jim Wallace, who is this year a fellow at Harvard Divinity School and the editor-in-chief of Sojourners magazine. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to have you all with us. The format that we're going to work with is to begin with just a few comments by me and then a series of opening statements by each of the individuals here, and then turning this into an open public discussion of this once prohibited dinner table topic. First, why religion and politics at the end of the 20th century? For more than half a century, I think most sociologists, political scientists, and other social scientists have talked regularly about the decline of religion in Western industrial societies. And to judge by any measure, including that of public opinion, that process of decline, of identification with religious faith, activism in congregations or faiths, has taken place in many countries among the Western industrial democracies, but not in the United States. George Gallup, who has polled on the subject of religion and religious belief in the United States now for over 50 years, has noted that when asked the question, do you believe in the existence of God, Americans with a regularity that is striking for virtually any question have consistently answered yes to that question with greater than 90% agreement among the American population, compared to a mean number for Western Europe, which hovers in the low 30%. Asked to identify what faith background they come from, over 80% identify themselves as Christian, which makes America more Christian than India is Hindu or Israel is Jewish. And yet America's Christian denominations or faiths are divided into more than, on the Protestant side, by one count, 1,400 to 1,600 different denominations. And by some counts, if you include single congregations and storefronts, as many as 10,000 or more, giving new meaning to the New Testament phrase, "In my Father's house are many mansions." What is striking about the role of religion in American politics is not only its persistence, but its persistence relevance to American politics. We all have heard, I'm sure, and remember in the 1980s, President Reagan's recollection of John Winthrop's description of this, our country, and in particular Massachusetts, as a city on the hill. And throughout the 18th and 19th and even on into the 20th century, we have talked about ourselves as a chosen people, as God's people, as somehow the chosen or the elect. And throughout any normal history of America, one looks back not only at the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but to the American Revolution, in the 19th century to the suffrage movement, to the abolition movement, to the struggle of the social gospel community in the progressive era, and then right on through the civil rights movement, and even most recently in the conservative Christian right movement, to find the presence of religious leaders, religious values, religious norms, and religious language shaping the debate that describes American politics. And so rather than thinking about why one should discuss American religion in the context of American politics, the question really is, how could we not? And the question that I'm hoping that the panelists and you will join in a lively conversation about is not merely how we have come to this place, but where we go from here. The landscape of America has changed drastically from 1796, when the president of Yale looked at the first American census of 1790 and concluded that this was a country of three great faiths: Congregationalists, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians, and saw nothing but unlimited opportunity for those three great and defining faiths of the American people. Much has changed, as you might imagine. What I'd like to do is have each of the speakers speak for approximately 5 to 7 minutes with an opening statement. I would like you to hold your questions until all of the speakers have spoken, and then we will open up for discussion. I was hoping that we could lead off with Jeff Taylor, Director of Governmental Affairs for the Christian Coalition, as a way of beginning the evening. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Jim. First, let me say it's an honor to appear at the ARCO Forum here at Harvard representing the Christian Coalition. I appreciate the invitation extended by the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee. This is a subject of which I have given much thought. Indeed, it is a subject that has shaped my life, my choices, my service, and my career. My initial response to the topic at hand is a comment on the topic itself. I find it illustrative that the question is not, should religion play a role in defining public values and influencing conventional politics? Perhaps you think it strange that I make such an observation, but let me respond by saying that our organization has had to defend the participation of religious conservatives in the American political process. So I find it refreshing to be invited to participate in a forum in which views across the religious and political spectrum can be openly discussed. I tend to take the long historical view when it comes to understanding the role of religion in American political life. Americans of deep religious faith have seen that faith impact their understanding of how their society should be ordered, and have been compelled by that faith to weigh in on the injustices of their particular day. Whether this was in the first century of our nation, with preachers across the nation weighing in for the righteous cause of the revolution, to the role of itinerant ministers who traveled across this land preaching that slavery was indeed a sin and it had to be abolished, to the role of Christian women earlier this century in fighting the dangers of alcoholism. Evangelicals and conservative Catholics have been involved in the political process. In reflecting on these movements of American believers, I'm confident that this generation will continue to exercise their citizenship and influence both the subject of our national debate and its outcome. And in fact, the impact of involvement by religious conservatives on our national political date can already be measured. Just last month, the Liberal Center for Gender Equality, run by former Planned Parenthood Executive Director Faye Waddleton, released a poll that was actually done in July of last year. The results of this poll were so overwhelming to them that they decided to release the poll during the height of the impeachment story, hoping no one would notice. The most noteworthy aspects of this poll show that a clear majority of American women are pro-life on the issue of abortion, which is contrary to the conventional wisdom that most women are pro-abortion. And by a 2-to-1 margin, American women believe that the agenda of the Christian Coalition will improve their lives. And in spite of recent comments by conservative icon Paul Weyrich of the Free Congress Foundation regarding the role of religious conservatives in the political process, Christian Coalition is in this game for the long run. We have just initiated our largest grassroots effort to date with the goal of raising $21 million over 21 months in preparation for the 2000 general election. We hope to train an additional 1.5 million conservative voters with 10 activists in every precinct in the country. Our legislative agenda, which is being unveiled this week on Capitol Hill, is just as bold and far-reaching. The agenda, entitled New Freedom for America's Families, a Blueprint for the 21st Century, is committed to supporting the American family and the bedrock values upon which this country was founded. 6 principles will be the focus of Christian Coalition in general, and my focus in particular. They are ensuring educational and economic opportunity, reforming Social Security and health care, strengthening our national security, preserving the sanctity of life, respecting religious freedom, and demanding tax fairness. I look forward to our discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Rabbi Lerner, will you,
1 second. Okay.
you'll follow.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about what I see as the frame of issues for the next century. So I believe that the fundamental political issue that will have significant religious, spiritual side is the globalization of the ethos of selfishness and materialism that will be eased by and accelerated by the globalization of capital. The flattening out of meaning and the reduction of the world to technical rational domination, where efficiency is seen primarily in terms of maximization of wealth and power for the interests of the few, without regard to the long-term ecological survivability of this planet. And the transcendence of national boundaries by capital will make it increasingly likely that democratic processes to constrain capital and to constrain, hence, corporate irresponsibility or to devise any rational plan to use the remaining resources of the planet, that the capacity of states to do that, the democratic processes to constrain capital and to use resources in a rational way will be dramatically decreasing over the course of the next several decades, and that this is the primary political issue facing our planet. Moreover, that the triumph of greed and materialism has allowed those in power and those who serve them in the universities and in the media to create a deep societal suspicion about any values that would transcend self-interest in the narrowest possible sense of self-interest. This, I believe, is the fundamental political issue that will be facing us over the course of the next several decades. And religious traditions have a stake in countering this globalization of capital with its concomitant globalization of selfishness and materialism, and a stake in reasserting the biblical notion that the earth belongs to the Lord, that we have no right to ownership, but only to provide stewardship for this planet. and that as a result, there will be increasing numbers of people in spiritual and religious traditions who find that their fundamental values are increasingly in conflict with the development of the globalization of capital. In short, there will need to be, and I believe there will be, over the course of this next century, an alternative to the globalization of capital, and that will be the globalization of spirit. Now, when I talk about the globalization of spirit, I want to contrast this with what I believe to be liberal and progressive politics as it appears in America today, and also with a significant sector of what goes for religious liberalism, or that is to say, the primary direction of liberal and progressive politics has focused on inclusion of those who have been excluded from the dominant ethos of the society, and has fought to bring in to the society those who are on the outside. That politics does not provide an alternative to the ethos of selfishness and materialism. On the contrary, in some ways it participates in that same ethos. And consequently, many of the religious groups that present themselves as liberal religious groups actually end up merely providing biblical quotes for whatever is the liberal agenda of the moment. But what I'm talking about is not providing biblical quotes for inclusion within the dominant social order, but that increasingly there will develop an alternative to that social order, that an alternative that requires a fundamental new way of thinking, a deeper critique, a new ethos of the globalization of spirit that questions the technical rationality and calls for a new bottom line. I call it the politics of meaning. And by the politics of meaning, I mean this, that the very definition of efficiency and productivity must be challenged by the religious worldview. The definitions of productivity and efficiency today that are at the core of what goes for economic studies and political studies and is never seriously challenged within the universities focuses on the maximization of wealth and power. And the new definition of productivity and efficiency that will be fought for by those who are pushing forward the globalization of spirit will be a definition that says that institutions and social practices will be judged efficient or productive not only to the extent that they maximize wealth and power, but also to the extent that they maximize our love, our solidarity, our capacity to see other human beings as fundamentally valuable, our ecological, ethical, and spiritual sensitivity. That is a fundamentally new bottom line, and this is not something that the current left or liberal or progressive world even includes or even begins to think about. So what I'm talking about here is a fundamental alternative to the globalization of capital, an alternative that I think has to address as central the development within each human being of their capacity for awe and wonder at the glory of this universe, and taking awe and wonder as a central thing that needs to be developed and institutionalized and brought into, made a place for in the institutions of the society. Now, in the process of the globalization of spirit, we will see a division between two forms of that. And one form will be both of these forms will challenge the current dominant bottom line, but one of them will take a more reactionary form. There is within the spiritual world a reactionary spirituality that seeks to challenge for good, and I identify with their challenge of the technical rationality of the contemporary world, but then poses as the alternative to it a return to various forms of authoritarian, hierarchical, or patriarchal societies. And on the other hand, there will be emerging, and there is already emerging, a different kind of spirituality that I call emancipatory spirituality. And the emancipatory spirituality both challenges the dominant ethos of this society, but also seeks not to return to hierarchical and patriarchal and repressive forms of spiritual life, but to a fuller development recognition of the individual within the spiritual community. Well, this I believe is in some very broad and vulgar way, trying to push this into 6 or 7 minutes, an outline of some of the fundamental struggles that will be faced in the 21st century, and the reason why the political landscape of the 21st century cannot be described and understood without understanding the emerging spiritual needs and articulation of those needs in politics.
Rabbi Lerner, thank you very much. Reverend Pennebaker, will you please go next?
Thank you. I first want to express Joan Campbell, my General Secretary's regret at not being here. If you miss her presence, and it's quite clear I am not Joan Campbell, then just think how much I miss her presence. I come from the National Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA. For those of you who are not too familiar with that, let me describe briefly what the National Council is in this 50th year of its history. It is a venerable American religious institution. It has a membership of 35 national church bodies, many familiar to you by name. The illustrious Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopalians, and a few others who finally made it to this shore. It is Protestant and Orthodox in its membership, including 8, 9, or 10 of the Orthodox communities, 7 of the 8 major African American religious communities. The mainline Protestant groups, there are 9 or 10 of those, the peace churches. It's a spectrum. It's a spectrum that includes about 150,000 local congregations in those church bodies, and 55 million American church members. But we'd be quick to say that doesn't mean all of that great conglomeration stands up and salutes when I say they should, or even when our General Secretary does. No, that's not our purpose even. It is to provide a frame of reference in which this segment of America's religious community can find some cohesive life and to play out that life in a constructive and progressive way in our shared life. So the National Council of Churches has across the years been identified with a number of movements of a public variety that have been on behalf of the common good. Clearly a major role in the civil rights movement, whose leaders again and again talk about how important religious communities and especially churches were in that point in our history. The anti-war movement would be another example, or the anti-apartheid movement. And so these are concerns for our common life. That is to say, the National Council and its churches have not been advocates in the public arena for their life or its life, but for our common life, from an angle of vision that is our religious heritage. Now, let me speak then in that framework to our topic tonight. I must say I find it hard to think that the question of severing religion and politics, for instance, is a serious question. I don't think for us in our heritage that's an option. I think I agree with you on that one. It's something very much at the core and heart of what it means to be religious. And our problem when we look at the role of religion in public life is that it's often measured as a kind of phenomena in the public life, rather than recognizing that our political instincts and our political participation are deeply rooted in the value systems that are formed out of our religious affirmation. So the point of convergence is not simply in the area of activity or even of endorsements or of public behavior, but it has something to do with what's very deep within. I think of the friend in the church who was very upset about the positions of some of the churches on public issues, and then he confessed to me as his pastor later. He said, "Well, you know, when I got in the booth and pulled the column and there was nobody in the voting booth but me and God. Then I came home. That is to say, there was something very deep that is not immediately measurable, that is at the heart of the tie between religious affirmation and political life. And so I want to say that the deeply held religious values that inform our life personally and our common life, things like a sense of justice, affirmation of human dignity and worth, the rights of life decisions rooted in human understanding and human maturity, the readiness to create a healthy and wholesome common life, a sense of human experience having spiritual meaning, and finally divine accountability. These values live, and they influence how we vote, how we participate, how we address our common life. The role of religion politically will continue to be, I think, what it long has been, to teach, nourish these sorts of values, this sense of life, week in, week out, sort of unspectacularly, and more or less faithfully. The second thing I want to underscore, I should, well, I'll come back to that. Religious voices will continue to speak and be heard authentically when they advocate a public life that reflects these kinds of values. To speak prophetically when the godly values are abused or ignored or violated in our common life. And so it's a kind of both and here. I appreciated what you said about a sense of wonder informing. I think I want to put with it what Carl Sagan put with it, which was also a sense of skepticism. And the two have to go together, it seems to me, if we're going to address our common life and address the way we function religiously. Third, organized religion will validate its life publicly by advocating a politics of the well-being of all people. When it's only a posture of private judgment or personal morality or individual spirituality, religion will become increasingly irrelevant in the body politic and eventually lose its credibility to be trusted even pastorally or devotionally. When I was a pastor, when I got involved in some kind of public issue, the counseling line outside my door always grew because folk began to see that church was somehow wrestling with life in some authentic ways. If otherwise, the church will be seen, the religious community will be seen as making no difference. Third, let's see, that was third. Fourth, specific disorders in our common life will lead religion into moral leadership and progressive compassion. There's a sense in which religion is probably on its firmest ground when it's reactive. I don't like that so well. But there's a sense in which the religious body sort of trusts the body politic until it gets too far out of line, and then religion rises up to say, no. See? Well, among these disorders will be the question of poverty. The religious community is going to address the elimination of poverty in our nation and attack it globally. Let me tell you, we got to be sure religiously that poverty is as morally abhorrent in the 21st century as slavery has become in the 20th century. Get a few votes there. Well, developing a credible and stable plan of provision for the elderly. Pursuing aggressively an authentic eradication of racism and its demeaning impact on all people. Defending a level playing field for all religious communities in the pluralism of our common life and in the heritage of United States commitments to religious liberty for all. 5, reminding our political leadership again and again of the need globally for respect, human rights, economic justice, shared provisions for the basic needs of life, food, shelter, health, education, and work as the essential elements in building peace, not military security, but life circumstance security. And 6, a constant engagement with the whole of creation to protect it and to stand against its exploitation in ways that infringe on all human life and violate the rights of rising generations, and especially teaching a mature sexuality in recognition of the good gift of life itself. Religious communities will be credible when their focus is not on their own life, but growing out of those deeper values focused on the quality of life that's shared by all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Wallace.
How many of you listen to car talk? All right? Not the question you're expecting to hear tonight.
That's good.
Well, the truth is, I came to Cambridge not just to be a fellow at Harvard, but I wanted to be close to the Click and Clack brothers. Just to experience kind of the aura of their presence. Because I listened to them back home in D.C., and one morning I heard them say, while I was taking a shower on Saturday morning, never criticize a person till you have walked for a mile in their shoes. Long pause. Because then when you criticize them, you'll be a mile away. And you'll have their shoes. Now, right away, I'm sleepy in the shower, I'm dripping wet, and I'm hearing this old, trite slogan, and they turn it around. They make it provocative. They make it creative, interesting. They woke me up. We talk about religion and politics. We've got to wake some people up here. Too many people think they know what we mean by religion and what it means for politics. I want to say just a few things to start out with. One is, religion is at its heart transformational. If faith is not transforming persons and neighborhoods and communities and nations, it isn't real faith. Faith changes things, transforms things, okay? So I would suggest that faith must transform our traditional political options. We're at the end of a century and a millennium. A lot's being said about that. I'd like to say this: the traditional political options and categories to solve our problems have become dysfunctional. They don't work. Most people, especially young people, realize that. So religion has to transform our political options, number one. Number two, our religious traditions have to help us find some common moral language in a pluralistic society to address the genuinely big issues, almost none of which are talked about every day in politics. The real things that affect our lives and our kids and the rest are not normally being talked about in politics per se. How do we transform the options, and how do we find that moral language? 30 years ago, Time magazine did a cover it said, "God is dead." Today, Newsweek, if you've seen the new cover, Jesus is on the cover of Newsweek again. Now they say, "Are angels real?" There's a hunger for spirituality in this country that is very, very deep. We have to think about that in a whole different kind of way. It's not just the popular culture. I have the blessing of working with kids on the street, coming out of gangs, who are doing gang truces, peace truces, and these are kids who are not from the youth choir. They're from the streets, and they talk about needing spiritual power, because what they have to change is, they'd say, ending the madness is so deep, we have to use spiritual power. So on every level, there's a hunger for spirituality. Secondly, there's a growing conversation here at Harvard, I found in this year, about ethics and everything. Ethics and public life, ethics and business, ethics and politics, ethics in the media, ethics, ethics, ethics. It's great, but we're kind of all hungry for an ethical conversation about our public life, okay? Spiritual hunger, an ethical kind of discussion that wasn't there before, and finally, I'd say, the role of faith-based organizations. I've been amazed at Harvard this year how much study, Anna's going to speak about that, how much study there is about faith-based organizations and what we're doing on the ground, whether it be welfare reform, job readiness, after-school programs for kids, addiction. There's even an acronym now I've learned at Harvard, FBOs, right? Faith-based organizations. When you're an acronym, you should begin to become worried. But we had the call to renewal that I'm involved in, had a summit about a month ago in D.C. We had 500 FBOs from 40 states across the country, 29 denominations, and you had some of the best on-the-ground programs in the country, whether it be on jobs or incarceration or health care or child care. The best work going on was there. And the call to renewal is an attempt to try and magnify the voice of those grassroots efforts around the country into a national network and voice. I just turned 50, I'll admit, this summer, and I'm getting this AARP card every month in the mail. I haven't sent it back yet, but they're very good. They're very organized, and they do a good job for senior citizens, okay? The constituency the Bible talks most about are poor and marginal people, widows and orphans and kids. There's not really a PAC for them yet in this country. But on the ground, a lot of faith-based organizations are doing that work, and yet there is no national voice to speak that message, and that's what Call to Renewal tries to do. I want to give you briefly, in the minute left, kind of our little menu for a new millennium. The things that we're going to talk most about in Call to Renewal. First is indeed overcoming poverty. Now, I want to say about this is this issue is uniting churches more than anything I've seen in a long, long time. We're having roundtables now with conservative evangelicals to Catholics to black churches, mainline churches. I've done the gang truce work, and it's harder, I must say, to get liberals and evangelicals at the table than Crips and Bloods. But they're doing it. They're doing it. And the issue is welfare reform, and the deeper issue is overcoming poverty, and what it means, what the Bible says to us about God's concern for those on the bottom. The second is dismantling racism. Now, let me say a word about that. There's a lot of conversation in a place like Harvard about multiculturalism. You know, it's like if we just enjoy each other's music and restaurants earnestly enough, we'll somehow overcome this problem of racism. I think, again, a more theological or biblical take is in order. From a biblical point of view, the problem of racism is an assumption called white privilege, white supremacy. The idea that this country is still fundamentally for people of European descent. Now, theologically, that's an idolatry. It's a demon, has to be exorcised from the body politic. Talking about racism at that deeper level, I think, is required of us. Thirdly, rebuilding family and community. Here is where we get into all the whole left-right politics. Who can deny that the nurturing bonds that hold us together and take care of our kids are in serious trouble? And yet, we have this polarization that keeps us from talking about the issue that's very real in our families and on our streets. We've got to reestablish those bonds and get beyond the old false choices. You know, you can be pro-family without scapegoating gay and lesbian people as if they're the ones responsible for the breakdown of the heterosexual family. You don't have to make these false choices. But you can be pro-family in a way that some of my friends on the left are afraid to be. And my friend Cornel West talks rightly about this as a toxic environment that is a war against parents. How do we talk about this in some new ways? Finally, our fourth platform is affirming life. And here the issue is deeper than abortion. And I would say that the real story is that people on the abortion question on different sides are beginning to find some common ground to actually reduce the abortion rate, which many of us across the spectrum find alarming, rather than just talk about it as a political symbolic political football. But the deeper issues are, how do you talk about the dignity and sacredness of human life in a way that becomes a political principle, that you apply to a whole range of issues, not just one narrow political issue? How do you talk about a consistent ethic of human life? Now, if we can manage this menu for a new millennium, we'll be beginning to overcome these left-right categories, because the left has talked about the first two, poverty and race, the right, the 3 and 4, family and life. I think we've got to talk about them all together and in a very new and different way, hopefully with some religious imagination that catches people's attention like Click and Clack did to me in the shower. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Professor Greenberg.
Now I have the challenge of bringing this all together. And as a social scientist who spends a lot of time going to church and going to congregations, I sometimes forget it's about faith and not about politics. And so this is it's instructive for me to be on this panel as well. But I do think there are two underlying questions that people are getting at on the panel. And the first is, how do we account for the enduring nature of religious influence in American politics and not look at this as some particular, and understand that we're at a particular historical moment, but in fact that many of the things that congregations do have been sort of around since the founding of the country. And the second is, and this is sort of more crass, but how do we account for the success of religious conservatives, and how do people on the left find a way maybe to reinvigorate progressive politics through religious institutions? Now, Tocqueville noted in the early part of the 19th century, quote, "Religion, which never intervenes directly in the government of society, American society, should therefore be considered as the first of their political institutions. For although it did not give them the taste for liberty, it singularly facilitates their use thereof." And he's making a claim which I think we can substantiate even today, which is that religious institutions, and congregations in particular, inculcate a citizenry with democratic norms. And the claim is somewhat problematic, in part because we have a much more religiously diverse religious landscape today than we did in the early part of the 19th century. But I still think that there's some strands of it that hold true. And second, that congregations nurture some sense of the collective good. Now, just to give some context, there are over 300,000 religious institutions in the United States. According to Gallup, and these are, I think, somewhat optimistic figures, but 67% of Americans claim that they belong to a religious institution, and 40% claim that they attend services every week. Now, there's obviously some social desirability effects at work here. It's not easy sometimes to admit that you don't go to church, but even if it's half that much, that's still a lot of people going to church every week. Even if it's 20% of Americans going to services and worshiping every week, it's a lot of people. Only 6% of U.S. adults will admit in a survey anyway that they have no religious preference. So religious institutions are the most extensive network of voluntary associations in the United States, and a substantial number of Americans are participating in them every week. And of course, while, as I need to often be reminded, that religious institutions are primarily a place where people worship, we also know that regular churchgoers are much more likely to vote than infrequent church attenders, that regular churchgoers are more likely to be involved in other forms of political activity, such as contacting government officials, or they're more likely to volunteer and be involved in community activity. So religious involvement increases political and communal engagement, and we can show that empirically, both through survey data and more sort of case study, qualitative research that I've done. And there's a number of sort of explanations for why this happens. The first is a social capital argument that Bob Putnam, who teaches here at the Kennedy School, has made very persuasively, that being involved in voluntary associations, in this case we say congregations, increases norms of reciprocity and trust and some sense of caring about the collective good. The second argument made by some people over in the government department here at Harvard is that in religious institutions and other kinds of voluntary associations, people learn useful skills, transferable skills that can be used in politics. So if you run a Bible study, chair a meeting, give a speech in church, that you will learn sort of important skills that if you go out into politics, you'll be more effective as a political actor. I think there's two other explanations, and I found this in my research. The first is that congregations are a place where people learn about politics and find opportunities to participate in politics. So it's sort of hard to determine from surveys what exactly is going on when people say they hear about politics in church. It's not the case that people hear a lot about partisan politics. So even though regular churchgoers are more likely to vote than infrequent church attenders, it is only about 7% of people in the United States report that the clergy talks about voting for a particular candidate, and about 14% say that there's sometimes information available. But this is sort of a separation between partisan politics and issue politics, because the numbers are dramatically different when it comes to issue-oriented politics. And it turns out, this is some survey work done by the Pew Research Center, 60% of Americans report that that the clergy talk about abortion, 87% that they talk about hunger and poverty, 56% that people talk about prayer in schools, 42% about pornography, 27% about the death penalty, 29% about right to die laws, 26% about health care reform, 21% about candidates in elections, 36% about laws regarding gays. So even though we don't see a lot of partisan politics happening in congregations in the U.S., we see a lot of issue politics. And obviously some groups are better than others at linking that to partisan politics. And one of the reasons why grassroots mobilization has been so effective on the right is that there's an extensive communication infrastructure and mobilization infrastructure on the right, which was built through the 70s and 80s, where religious leaders are able to credibly make a link between these issues and electoral involvement, and actually find ways to channel people politically into those issues. The other, and this sort of speaks to my last point, is the other reason why congregations are so important to political life is that they are embedded in politically relevant social networks. I mean, congregations don't exist by themselves in isolation. People who belong to church and to religious organizations have overlapping memberships in parties and unions and civic associations and in government. And so the people who are involved in congregations bring that overlapping membership with them, share information with people around them, share information with religious leaders. And congregations themselves have formal ties and informal ties to parties, to unions, to government through some of the new innovation on welfare reform, to parties through, especially in the black church, very strong ties to the Democratic Party and black churches. So the main point is that there are things going on inside of congregations that increase people's engagement with politics and community. They're learning about politics and learning about opportunities to get involved in politics. And as institutions, congregations themselves are embedded in politically important networks. So just to very quickly answer this last question about why, in some sense, have religious conservatives been so much better at organizing at the grassroots than religious liberals. And to sort of make a prediction, I actually think this trend is going to sort of stay the way it is for a while. And I think it's because if we look at what makes congregations, to the extent that they're concerned with it, good at organizing in politics, it's a few things. They have well-integrated members, and conservative churches tend to be better at integrating their members. They tend to offer more activities for families. They have activities during the week. They have activities on the weekends. This is true of the black church as well. So that the congregation itself becomes not just a place to go to for Mass once a week, but someplace where you live your whole life, your whole social life, and your whole family's social life. The second is that leaders are able to make a really strong connection between faith, the transformative part of going to church, and political issues. And again, on the right, I believe that religious leaders have been better at doing that. And in part it's because on the left, there is a bigger disparity of the ideological beliefs on the elite level and the beliefs of people in congregations. So that in the mainline Protestant churches, for instance, the elite level is much more progressive and liberal than people going to church. And that's not necessarily true in conservative churches. And third, and I mentioned this briefly, on the right there are stronger institutional ties to other kinds of organizations that have been very good at mobilizing people into politics. So again, sort of the trans-denominational networks that religiously conservative congregations have been a part of have been very effective at organizing people in electoral politics, while on the left, for instance, unions and other kinds of organizations have been, relatively speaking, on the decline. So, that's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Greenberg. What I'd like to do is actually, because of the time, open this up for discussion, to invite you to step forward to the microphones and to identify yourself and to offer a question of the panelists. Who would like to go first? Please step up in front of the microphone.
Rabbi Lerner, I think that...
Please identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Bob Powell. Rabbi Lerner, I think this is covered across the board, but the whole idea of, that was just mentioned by Ms. Greenberg, about the liberal organizations having a lot more diversity, perhaps, and this maybe make it more difficult to integrate a cohesive politic and agenda. How would you respond to that critique?
I mean, for one thing, I think that the categories liberal and conservative are 20th century categories that are not going to be real useful in the coming period and real helpful in describing what's going on. But one different way, this is not the alternative category, but this is at least a different way to understand politics, is I believe that in every one of us, there is a part of us that has bought into the dominant ethos of this society and believes that there is no ethical or spiritual community possible, and that consequently, the only rational thing for us to do as individuals is to look out for our own self-interest without regard to the consequences for others. And to the extent that we're there, we are far from an ethical or a spiritual or a God-oriented politics. And another part of us that really wants to go for our highest ideals, that really wants to connect to a biblical vision, that wants to connect to God, whatever is the right language that you want to use for this, that is oriented towards a spiritual alternative. And that this is inside of virtually every single person in the society, regardless of how they define their politics. And that which part gets acted on in part is based on what is each person's assessment of what is happening around them and what likelihood is there that other people will act on their highest ideals versus their belief that everyone is likely to act on their own narrow self-interest, and that consequently one would be self-destructive and crazy in some communities to act on an alternative vision. Now, it's understanding the surges of energy that go in this way or in that way that is a better frame for understanding politics, so that it's not, for example, that people suddenly became conservative in 1994, but that to understand how Bill Clinton and the presidency, this is just a narrow, specific example, of how Bill Clinton and what he did in office undermined the hopefulness that people had in 1992 when they voted for him, and led people to despair about the possibility of possibility. And when people despair about the possibility of possibility, then they all go back into, well, let's define politics in the most narrow self-interested terms rather than in the sense of a we. So what I'm trying to reach here for, if you get what I'm talking about, surges of energy towards hope versus surges of energy towards despair and cynicism and isolation and intense individualism, etc. These are different ways of thinking about politics than the old language and the old frameworks that the universities, I think, are still stuck in.
Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Amy Sullivan, and I have a question for Mr. Wallace. Professor Greenberg pointed out, I think correctly, that one of the characteristics which can make the not conservative religious organizations, if you want to call them liberal or middle of the road, what can make them exciting is their diversity of beliefs, which can make for interesting conversation, but makes it difficult to mobilize on issues. I think poverty might be an exception to this, but I'm wondering what ideas you have to overcome this sometimes difficult characteristic of religious organizations.
Just tying this to the last question and response from Michael, to me the issue again is not liberal or conservative. The issue is the extent to which someone's faith directly ties to their action in the public square. And when we are clear about that, people are mobilized and they respond, and it's very interesting. When we're not clear about that, it gets very theoretical, confusing, and disempowering. I mean, we can go back 100 years and talk about how Christians mobilized their faith. In fact, Charles Finney was the evangelist of his day, and he invented the altar call. And the history suggests that he did it because, as a revivalist and an abolitionist, he wanted to get the names and addresses of his converts to sign them up for the abolitionist struggle. So he had an altar call to sign. He was an organizer. Now, that direct tie-in with revivalism and abolitionism, we see in the black church and the freedom struggle in this century. We see that in the Christian right in the latter half here. And I'm seeing it now around the issue of poverty. I'm seeing evangelicals, charismatics, Pentecostals, black church, mainline, the whole spectrum, coming together around the issue of welfare reform, and the real issue is not that, but what's happening to poor people. And the deeper biblical issue is one of inequality. When that's tied together, people are mobilized. When we're not clear about the tie-in to faith, people get very confused, and there's no empowering going on. So to me, it's not liberal or conservative, but whether there's a direct tie-in to what one believes about faith and how one acts in the public arena. That's the issue.
Yes, over here.
Yes, this is for Mr. Taylor.
Speak
Yes,
to that a
I-
little bit. I want to speak to that question a little bit too, because, you know, wasn't there a politician around here one time said all politics is local? Didn't Tip say that?
He sure did.
It was a local politician.
Local politician, right, local politician.
It's typical.
There's a sense in which all religion is local. And until, you know, it's in local communities where the ties begin to be built. And part of the job of the religious institution, which also has the political experience you're talking about, part of that is providing handles through that local congregation through which people can take hold of local political issues and local quality of life issues out of their religious commitment.
This is for Mr. Taylor and for Reverend Pennybaker, and the others will, I'm sure, jump in. I'm Jack Nissan Porter. I'm the spiritual leader of Temple Emmanuel in Marlborough, a Jewish temple. I want to ask him more. What you're talking about is very ethereal. Let's talk about something basic, the Bible. How can we interpret the Bible? For example, today, I spent all day lobbying against the death penalty at the State House, and I think we'll win. And I know it was a very unusual coalition of His Eminence, you know, Catholics and Bernard Law, liberal Protestants and Jews. We all united on this. We all saw the text as this, in the same way. But if I know if it was abortion, the Protestants, you know, Jews would not be there. How can we, and there's many other examples, not just beating a kid. I see interpretation of you have a right to beat your child or wife because that's in the Bible, and I can look at another place in the Bible that says you shouldn't. So I ask him, you know, very respectfully, how would you interpret the Bible? How can we have a common ground, all of us religion, in interpreting? Maybe we need a study group, you know, inter-religious study group, but that's the question to you, Mr. Taylor and to Mr.
Anyway, I certainly don't have a corner on this market. I welcome any of the rest of you want to talk about this. I think this is an age-old question, of course, and we continue to struggle with this, and one of the rules is we got to talk to each other. And we've got to talk to each other around Scripture and around what it means and angles of vision. We've got to recognize that there are inner conflicts in Scripture. One piece of Scripture will argue against another piece of Scripture. And we all play that game sometimes. And it seems to me we've got to grow out of that kind of conversation to have something of a kind of godly vision that begins to inform and build common ground for our addressing the circumstances of life in which I suspect, Rabbi.
I'm not a rabbi, I'm a spiritual leader.
Okay,
That's a
spiritual
rabbi
leader.
without ordination. But,
Okay.
but it's
You
close.
can't always tell by looking.
No. That's right. I don't have my yarmulke on. That's
You
right.
got it. Okay. But I suspect that's really what happens in your temple, is that there is some debate around Scripture. I doubt most temple congregations I've known didn't all line up and salute the same way on Scripture. And that out of that debate, though, came a kind of godly vision that took that took the mandates of God on life. I was interviewed the other day in New York about why churches are concerned about the shooting of the black guy by the police there. And I said, for two reasons. We got a neighbor that hurts, and we have a God who is offended. And there was no difficulty with that. We understand what that's about, and we have a common vision that draws us into that public life. Others may want to comment.
Let me just also respond to that. There's a passage in Scripture that talks about each of us have fallen short, and I think that is especially true when it comes to a full and overwhelming understanding of what God is trying to say to each generation through His holy texts. And I would agree with Mr. Pennybaker here that we all are challenged to not only study scriptures on our own, but to study together and to dialogue. And I think that's an ongoing and never-ending project. Even though we are pretty consistently perceived to be on the right, and I think that's a correct perception, we find ourselves, dialoguing and forming coalitions with folks that maybe are on the other side of the aisle on particular issues. I mean, for one, the religious persecution bill that went through last year was signed by the president into law. We dialogued and we're compatriots with members who with either denominations or other religions that tend to be maybe more on the left on other issues. But we worked in common cause with them on that particular issue. So, and you find that for those that do work in Washington, Mr. Pennybaker knows this very well, that happens all the time. This coalition on this particular issue will break up and form on other issues. So that's the challenge, and that's the challenge that we have as people of faith.
There are questions above here, and I'll take one over here.
My name is Preston Golson. I'm a freshman at the college. I'd like to address this question to Mr. Wallace. You mentioned that there is a common ground forming on abortion issues. I would like to wonder if you could elaborate on this and say some of the ideas that are being generated between pro-choice and pro-life groups where we're beginning to find some common ground.
There are, in my experience, a number of issues where the debate is controlled by the edges of the conversation. And a lot of people are waiting for a yet-to-be-articulated kind of common ground on a number of issues. This is one that I think is the case. Most people in this country believe that the abortion rate is alarmingly high in this nation. Pro-choice and life, both sides, I find people, when they're pressed, would say the abortion rate, 1.4 or 5 million, is alarming. Yet that issue is used consistently as sort of a political litmus test, and that abortion rate doesn't ever change. It continues to be what it's been for a long time. I find people, mostly women, there's a whole common life network, a common ground network now of women on both sides, trying to find where they can agree, where they can find some common conviction and action. Teenage pregnancy is a huge area where we can come together and try and reduce teenage pregnancy. Adoption reform, critical area where that could make a difference. Offering alternatives to women who are stuck and trapped in dead ends and dangerous circumstances where they feel like they've got no choices. There are lots of places where constitutional amendments don't even come into the conversation yet, where people can talk about ways we can together try to reduce the abortion rate. And women who are pro-choice and pro-life are doing that, again, in neighborhoods, in their own communities. To me, that's a good sign, not just for that issue, but for a range of issues, trying to find solutions where we can identify the points where we can agree on some common goals, like trying to dramatically reduce the rate of abortion. And those people wouldn't necessarily agree on a constitutional amendment or other kinds of legal sanctions, but when it comes to trying to support women, kids who are having kids, that becomes then the common ground.
If I could just also respond and follow up on that, I mean, I agree with much of what you've just said, and I think for those of us on the right who care very deeply about the life of the unborn, the most voiceless members of our culture today, one of the things that I think, as we dialogue among ourselves, realize that we need to do a better job of understanding the dilemma of the woman who finds herself pregnant and she doesn't want to be there, and feeling that she doesn't indeed have a choice, a real viable choice of carrying this child to term and either keeping the child or giving it up for adoption. And because of her circumstances or whatever it happens to be, whether it's she's in high school and she wants to still be a teenager and go run around with her friends, or an unwed mother with already 2 children and she's now pregnant again, and her job prospects are pretty bleak. So we recognize that we've got to do a better job of providing real choice for that woman in that circumstance and being able to articulate that.
There's an operative principle that I try to employ, not just on this issue, but lots of issues. What are the essential concerns or grievances of constituencies in their battle over a political issue? And what you find is, for example, on this question, the sacredness of human life and the rights of women, even I would just name a feminist agenda, are not necessarily incompatible. There are people who hold to a feminist agenda and who also are concerned about the abortion rate. And that conversation becomes a creative one when it takes us out of the old categories and tries to find some new solutions that don't continue to repeat the impasse which has us divided.
All right. A question over here.
My name's David Alida Garcia. I'm a second year here at the Kennedy School, and my question's for Jeff Taylor. I'm always interested to hear the Christian Coalition detail its list of issues that it sees as priorities. And what's particularly interesting is how so many issues that seem to many people as not remotely Christian make the list. One example you mentioned was military spending. And my question simply is this: is there any conservative issue that the Christian Coalition would endorse? Or rather, is there any conservative issue that the Christian Coalition wouldn't endorse because it's not sort of an issue that's, able to be thought of in sort of religious, Christian especially, terms? And I'm thinking of sort of like tax cuts, vouchers, increased military spending. It seems like almost any conservative issue will be embraced, and then the language will follow to defend its inclusion.
Well, first let me just make a correction. We're not interested in military spending per se, but in the nature of our national defense. I think that's a different way of looking at it. The Christian Coalition has always had a broad agenda. I mean, I think our critics have always tried to pigeonhole us and say that we are the party that just cares, or a group that just cares about life issues and the homosexual agenda, or opposing the homosexual agenda. And that has never been the case. And we have always seen ourselves as Christians who are also Americans. And we have interests in all the range of issues that confront all Americans. Now, because of our limitations of budget and expertise, we don't weigh in on every single issue that's before the 106th Congress. But we sat down. In fact, what prompted this whole thing was in November, I sat down with the board, and we kind of evaluated the 105th Congress, this past Congress, and then we talked about where do we go from here. And out of a 5-hour session in which we put all kinds of ideas up on the board, issues that we just care about as citizens, whether we happen to work for the Christian Coalition or not. And as we thought that through, and we're coming out of an ethos of Christianity, and that doesn't limit us to, Social Security is not in the Bible, but the principles behind Social Security of caring for one generation, of providing for your family. Jesus used the examples of the ant and the grasshopper. The ant would be busy all throughout the season, the summer, gathering and preparing for the long winter. The grasshopper was a free and easy care critter, and he got stuck and he dies at the end when cold weather arrives. Well, I think you can extrapolate from that we need to be looking towards the future and preparing for retirement. So I think that provides many examples for how we're able to weigh in on particular social issues that you may not be able to go to a specific verse and say, welfare reform is here in 1 Corinthians 3. But it does, because we have a Christian worldview, it impacts how we look on particular issues.
Did you? Up here. Did you want
Yeah,
to
I guess. I want to highlight the following point, that there is, somehow this is too nice here. It's like there's, and somehow we're kind of avoiding at a level of discourse that we're managing to avoid where there's conflict and struggle that I think also ought to be out on the agenda. So I'm just trying to help facilitate that process. By saying that there's, there is the question, I've posed it as, what is the bottom line? That is, when you're actually getting down to it and looking at specific political issues, are you interested in maximizing the well-being of some narrow group or some particular group, or are you seeing every human being as created in the image of God and equally deserving of God's love and care? Now, there is a real difference there. For example, if you are thinking that the most important thing to do from a religious perspective is to defend American interests, as opposed to asking how, if every human being, if there's 6 billion creatures on the planet, and every one created in the image of God, they're then maximizing the interest of every one of those beings as equally valuable and equally, that leads to a different politics. And I think that applies also in the way in which a conservative politics has really affected a delegitimation of the public sphere, a giving up on us doing anything together. And one of the things that deeply troubles me about the moral legitimacy or the spiritual honesty of people on the right is that on the one hand, I very often hear them talking about the problems of the public sphere and its inability to really deliver on spiritual values. But on the other hand, I don't see the conservative movements in this country actually acting to bring home, person by person, the people in the streets who don't have a place to sleep at night. In other words, it would be a very different politics in American society if the conservatives who rejected the public sphere and said we don't want government to do it were actually doing it themselves. We're actually, in fact, bringing home homeless every night into their home. So there's a certain hypocrisy in the political debate. Now, I'm not saying this from the standpoint of somebody who thinks that the left is so much better on this question. On the contrary, I often feel like the left also needs to inject into itself an ethos of caring about each individual much more and not just talking in abstract principles. But I think that there's a way in which this discussion is going that is avoiding the level of conflict that needs to be out there on the table, let's say.
Question up here.
My name's Jerome Sokolovsky. I'm a graduate student here and at the Kennedy School. And my question is for anyone on the panel who cares to address it. Speaking of conflict and struggle, I'm wondering to what extent a religious nation like ours should require moral behavior on the part of its political leaders. I think you know what I'm referring to.
Dear.
Did everyone's eyes turn to Professor Greenberg for the analytic view? Or
I'm a social scientist. I don't have to answer that kind of question.
Well, I'll be glad to respond to that if no one else will.
I would.
I'll join too.
I'm sure everybody here on the panel has, some strong views about this. Whether you're referring to, everybody thinks about Bill
What's he
Clinton.
talking about?
He didn't say it, but everybody thinks Bill Clinton. And, whether you voted for him or not, I do think that what we have been through this past year as a nation is nothing short of tragic. We have been distracted. We have been appalled at the subject matter that has now been that is discussed on national news, that's discussed at the dinner table. I have many friends who have had to turn off the nightly news because of they didn't want their young children to hear what was being discussed about the man who holds the highest office in our land. And I think it's going to take us a while to recover from what he has inflicted upon our nation, both spiritually and politically. And frankly, I think we will see in this year 2000 election the same phenomena that we saw right after Nixon and Watergate, and of course his handpicked successor, Mr. Ford. And the public was tired of it all, and they turned to someone that they saw was a very moral and uprighteous man, or a righteous man that they frankly didn't know a whole lot about, and that was Jimmy Carter. And I suspect that something very similar to that will happen in the year 2000 as well.
Yeah, I just want to get a few levels of this question, because I do think there are many levels. Number one, I think it's been a tremendous success of the political right in this country, that they've managed to get us to believe that moral issues are only about sex, and not about the degree to which, for example, we let people starve to death in our streets, and not about the degree to which we are engaged in destroying the earth, and hence ignoring the consequences of our acquisitive behavior on future generations. Now, that they have been able so successfully to do that we can think that this is what moral is about, I think is a tragic moment in politics, and a great success for those whose goal is to delegitimate the public sphere so that there will be no possibility of constraining the major economic forces that are acting irresponsibly in the public sphere. So that's one level. Now, on a second level, I think that should not obviate us from, not stop us from at the same time saying that there are certain kinds of moral behavior in regard to sexual behavior that should not be condoned by a society. And basically, from my standpoint, it's this. We should not be in favor of the manipulation of other human beings for our own needs or desires without regard to the consequences for them or for anyone else. And that is not a sexual prudery, but it is saying that there should be a moral standard in regard to sexuality, and that is also important. But now you add the issue of leadership. And here I have a different view than many on this. I think that we make a huge mistake to demand of our leaders that they be on a higher moral plane than everyone else in the society. Because when you demand of your leaders that they not acknowledge the ways in which they too are screwed up human beings like everybody else, you will end up guaranteeing that your leaders will be liars. Your leaders will have to be liars to pretend that they are on a higher moral plane. Does this mean that therefore I excuse that behavior? No. What I want to see is a politics that raises all of our moral behavior by insisting on human beings treating each other in a loving and caring way, but not acting as though without a sense of compassion for the way in which every one of us is a flawed human being and likely to continue to be flawed, whether they're in politics or not.
Go ahead.
Can I use another another example. One of the things that really disturbs me is when religious forces become incredibly self-righteous. And I'm fairly familiar with that. I live in that arena. And I think we need to be taught by what I've observed recently in the predominantly African-American churches. A tragic event occurred in the moral and manipulative behavior of the president of one of the great African-American black churches of this country. And how did that church respond? Finally, he resigned from office. His congregation embraced and forgave him. Now, why is that? Because when this occurs in our kind of racist society that has forced desperate behavior often, then there is a recognition that when this is an attack even on a very human, mistaken, manipulative black leader, that something very sad and very tragic has occurred and been reinforced, and it's to be dealt with in terms of forgiveness and a new beginning out of that circumstance that is exposed. And so it seems to me we would do well as a nation to learn from our black churches and our black friends about how to deal with this humanity that we share and often mess up.
There's this, the question of the lessons we haven't learned, I suppose, from this crisis. And the problem is that most of us are tired of talking about it, and yet there are a lot of lessons we haven't learned. I certainly, as those of you who know where I stand on these things, think that the treatment of the poor is the sort of the overwhelming biblical test. The question before came up what the Bible says, the biblical test of a nation's righteousness. From the prophets, from Jesus, overwhelming material says how we treat those who are most vulnerable in our midst. That's the overriding sort of public question. But I also come from a tradition which says that one's personal behavior and, yes, sexual ethics are also part of the conversation. I come from a tradition which says that that finally, in the end, sexuality, sexual relations are to be more covenantal than just recreational. And I think that's an important religious issue as well. And one can be very committed to social justice, as I want to be, and yet say there are other issues about family life and spouses and kids and all the rest that are critical. We've, again, made a lot of these false choices in this conversation. And you have the Democrats ending up looking like they're excusing Bill Clinton's behavior, and the Republicans look like they're the ones standing around throwing stones at the woman taken in adultery while Jesus watches on. And these kind of choices really impoverish our public debate. The one lesson I think we haven't learned yet well at all is that I do think it's a mistake to think that there is a firewall between a person's personal life, integrity, choices, inner life, you might say, and their public performance as a leader. I think that is a mistake to draw such a clear, and to the extent that the White House has encouraged that, I think that's to our detriment, or the media. I think there is a connection. Again, I'm from a tradition which talks about forgiveness and restoration, but also one that talks about you need to, particularly if you're a public leader, to learn to navigate the inner waters of your soul as well as the public seas of political discourse. And I think we have to look at that question. The issue here is not so much sex, but leadership. What kind of leadership are we talking about? And I think that's going to be troubling us for some time to come. Some of us have felt politically homeless on this because, on the one hand, we've been unable to sort of be as defending of the president as some others have been on the liberal left side. but unable to embrace the broader political agenda of his critics. And Mr. Starr and the House managers and all that they represent. I'm offended when I hear Henry Hyde say that lying during Iran-Contra was all right. Iran-Contra, I think, were impeachable offenses by Presidents Bush and Reagan, and those haven't been talked about, and yet this is. And so there's an agenda that I can't embrace from those critics of the president, yet on the other hand, I squirm and get squeamish about the defenses of Bill Clinton from some of my friends on the liberal left. So again, there are a lot of politically homeless people on this question for whom an articulation has yet to come that would adequately solve this very difficult dilemma.
Professor Greenberg.
From the perspective of someone who studies public opinion, I think sort of the American people feel a bit homeless on this issue as well. I think that if you look at sort of the president's approval ratings over time and the fact that they didn't drop and at times went up, it showed that in general people sort of felt the economy was doing well, and in general they sort of agreed with Clinton's policy agenda. And while troubled, definitely troubled by his behavior, were resistant to, I think, defining his sexual behavior as the sort of sum total of what would constitute a moral leader. And I think that if you look at a lot of issues that are very contentious at the elite level, in fact, most Americans walk sort of a middle ground. So if you look at something like the death penalty, something like abortion, a lot of these issues, most Americans are fairly moderate. And the problem is not translating these new categories at the level of the mass public, but at the elite level. So if you look, for instance, at the Republican and Democratic parties, over time, increasingly activists in the Republican Party have become more religious, and activists in the Democratic Party have become more secular, which can be linked directly to polarization over issues like abortion. So I think that the challenge of sort of these new categories that both Michael and Jim are talking about is not so much at the mass level; it's at the elite level.
That's true.
I count at least 8 more questioners standing here, but I also, by my clock, believe that we're reaching the end of the time that we have allotted to us this evening. As a consequence, I want to thank all of you for coming here this evening to join this in what I hope is the first of a series of ongoing forum conversations about the integration of religion and politics, and that you will join us again. I would also like to thank all of our guests, wish them well, thank all of them for coming through what has been horrendous meteorological circumstances in many of their cases, and bid them Godspeed. Thank you.
So you're in Washington, but you're up here for right now.
I'm a fellow for the year.
So you finish up in May or June?
Yeah, that's good translation for a night like this, yes.
Well, I live in